Well, good evening. So my name's Leon, and I started off being a graphic designer in my teens, actually. It's sort of the only thing that I've ever wanted to do. I built my first website in '97, and since then I've seen the web go through quite a lot of change. Just to get an idea, would most people here say that they've been working with the web for a while, or are you fairly new to it? Experienced? New? Okay, wow. Good mix. Over the years, we've seen a lot of really interesting things happen with the web. Lately, we've been looking a lot more at the way that we approach our web design. There's been a lot of emphasis on designing responsively, mobile first, for example. But something that I think has been creeping up for a lot of designers is designing for HiDPI devices. You know, sorry, just for as long as I can remember, we've been designing to the pixel. I was always brought up that you'd go into Photoshop, you'd set up your document to, at one point it was 800 by 600, but then it went to 1024, and now you just sort of set it as big as you can. We'd set it up to the pixel. That was the unit of measurement that we used. I'd been always told that we should always use 72 DPI for the resolution of that document, and it always just seemed to work. Whatever you'd draw in Photoshop would display on the web or on the device. And I think as designers we're conditioned to have that sort of control. So, you know, we're conditioned with amazing tools where we can just specify exactly what we want. We want it to be 100 pixels, we want it to be exactly this shade of pink, we want it to be this font, we want it to be this size. But now things are really starting to change with HiDPI, because a pixel is no longer a pixel. Now, all of this sort of happened in June 2010 when a device called the iPhone 4 came out. It featured this thing called a Retina display, and it was the sort of thing that you could only really appreciate if you looked at it. You could look at it on your screen, but you're looking at it in a standard DPI monitor. So the term HiDPI, the Retina display, as it was promoted, is actually a Apple term, and the meaning behind this phrase that they've coined is a pixel density so high that your eye can't distinguish individual pixels. And for me, this just turned my world upside down. All of a sudden, what do we do, right? And then you started to notice a trend. After the iPhone 4, you had a 4S, and then there were other high DPI devices coming out into the market. Just this year, there's been a laptop released, which is high DPI. And I believe down the track we'll have desktop monitors, TVs, all in high DPI. So I want to talk a little bit about HiDPI and what that means. First of all though, resolution. So traditionally we talk about resolution as DPI. Now DPI is a term that's used in the print world of design. It stands for dots per inch. And essentially that defines how many dots per inch you can get. So that tells you how sharp the images are. Dots don't actually exist on the web, on monitors. We call them, sorry, that should actually be pixels per inch. PPI is pixels per inch. That's what we measure them in. But something really interesting as well, which kind of blew my mind, is that resolution doesn't actually really exist on devices. All it is pixels. So essentially pixels are pixels. There is no resolution. So if you have a resolution of 72 PPI or a resolution of 1000 PPI on an image which is 100 pixels by 100 pixels, it's still going to be 100 pixels by 100 pixels, no matter what you change that resolution to be. Resolution only really comes into play when you're taking those images and you're using them for print. And so that's where the whole 72 DPI came about. As a sort of a standard, that was sort of the average size image that you would get would fit into the text that you're using. So pixels now, there's two types of pixels. We've got device pixels, which are the actual pixels on the device. And then we've got another measurement called CSS pixels. They aren't exactly the same thing, although traditionally they've been pretty much the same thing. You could always just refer to a CSS pixel and it would look, one CSS pixel would be one device pixel. Not so much the case anymore. Essentially with high DPI devices, they've been able to squeeze twice as many pixels into the same amount of space. So on the left there you can see we've got standard displays, and on the right we've got high DPI or Retina displays. So the CSS measurement is still the same. It's still 2 pixels on the standard, it's still 2 pixels on the Retina display. Although on the Retina they've pushed more pixels into it. It brings with it some problems as well. One of those is obviously file size. So we're not only doubling the file size, we're actually quadrupling it. But at least there's a small trade-off, is that our images can have more fidelity in them. Yeah. Sorry. So when we go out to create our images now, they should really be twice the size as what you would traditionally create them. So for a 100 by 100 pixel picture, you would create your picture to be 200 by 200 pixels. So then that would then scale down for Retina displays, and then the pixels would line up on top of each other. It's really cool, but to be honest, it's really annoying as well. I'm super excited that we've got these high DPI devices now where you just can't see pixels anymore on them. But there's so many factors now that this has also brought to a lot of web design studios. It's not really easy to just sort of upscale your current website to work with high DPI devices, there's a lot of cost, and I would actually say it's probably twice as expensive to design for high DPI devices. A lot of that cost could be minimised though if we implement different strategies to the way that we approach design for high DPI devices. And essentially what that means is that we need to use less raster graphics and use more vector-based graphics. And by that, I'm talking about using icon fonts. So we can spool those up and display those. They have a lot of benefits. Obviously, we could scale them to any size. You can apply colours to them. And they can also be very handy, especially when you're using them on mobile layouts as well. Using more SVG-based graphics. So these are vector-based files, but they're really only good for simple kind of graphics, things like logos, maybe diagrams, maybe like a floor plan or something. And the other thing that designers need to use more of is CSS3. A lot of the traditional raster-based graphics consisted of lots of drop shadows, rounded corners, gradients, all of that sort of thing. But we can now do a lot of that with CSS3. So we need to really think about the tools that we have available to us before we get into Photoshop and start planning our designs. So when I go into Photoshop now and I'm creating a new template for a high DPI device, I actually don't change how I've approached design in the last 10 years at all. I'll still set up my document to be 960 pixels wide. I still keep my resolution at 72 DPI. Probably the only thing that has really changed for me is utilising more of the vector components in Photoshop. Things like using layer styles, smart objects. If you've created your logo in Illustrator or something, and you're as well. That's the way that, those are the options that we have available to us at the moment. But yeah, high DPI, there's not a lot of standard at the moment. In fact, there is no standard to my knowledge. This is one of the proposed standards at the moment, where essentially you would use a picture element, and within that element you then go through and define the different types of sources and the different types of requirements on when that source should be used. It's pretty cool, to be honest, because it means that we have a lot finer grain control over the images that we push to devices. I'm not sure of how much of a headache that will be for developers though. I think a lot about, well, how would you integrate with that with like WordPress, for example, or an application to sort of generate these different sized images on the fly, and at the same time allow the user to have that control where they can pick and choose which image gets used in which application. And down the bottom there you can see that there's also a recommendation on how that could be managed for print. So you could actually put in there a source of a file with a resolution of maybe 300 DPI, and that would be pretty cool, especially if you're a publisher or something. This is another approach where, just on that last one as well. I haven't tested this, but I did read something just last week that the latest bleeding edge of Chrome actually supports this. So that could be really cool. This is another way of managing different images. So this is actually quite attractive as well. Whereas in this last one, you can see how many different types of images were files that we've had to define. But in this one, we can do it all within that same class. So, yeah, it is really quite scary. But the good news is that our process actually doesn't really change too much. Thank you. Yeah.
So you mentioned moving to vector graphics, but like how are the browsers supported? Like does the problem with vector graphics not much support?
Well, yes and no. Sorry. So the question was with regards to vector support in browsers and how that's a little bit of an issue. I'd argue that case and say that browsers are actually getting pretty cool. You know, they're being able to be a lot more standards based. Are you referring to anything specifically? Sorry. Yeah, definitely, especially IE 7 and 8. I'm pretty sure media queries don't work with those browsers. Pretty sure font face doesn't work with them either. There's a lot of things that don't work with them. IE 9's not too bad. Hopefully IE 10 will be pretty cool. But I mean, you know, your WebKit-based browsers, Safari and Chrome, they're just rocking this. They're really doing some pretty cool stuff. And so is Firefox. I'm amazed at the leaps and bounds Firefox is going through at the moment. So that honestly doesn't concern me, the browsers. You know, they've only just released a HiDPI laptop this year. I think probably by this time next year, we'll probably have desktops, and then things start to get really serious. But yeah, I'd start trying to implement it now. SVG is probably one of the more complicated ones out of that set, out of icon fonts, SVG, and CSS3 techniques. But the benefits are there. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So the question was if I'm seeing much difference to using more vector-based graphics. Not a lot. Like, the process really is still the same. There have been a couple of tricky occasions though, particularly with image sprites. I've found that by using double the size images for image sprites, there's a lot of additional work there, just in terms of testing. And traditionally the way I'd do image sprites is I'd actually just do separate images, and then I'd put them all together in one document. So maybe then there could be a better approach, starting with just one document and then putting your sprites into that and just keeping it in one document.
Might be a silly question, but you mentioned like
Yeah.
wasn't exactly sure what they are.
So icon fonts, sorry, the question was basically more information about icon fonts. Icon fonts are sort of on the up and up, especially now as font face is being more widely used and supported by the browsers. It's a more viable option to be able to make use of the glyphs inside font files. We can then pull those up and use them in our websites. There's a really cool website that I'm thinking of, but the name has just escaped me, where you can actually just type a word. Speak out if somebody knows what I'm talking about. You'll type like the word home, and it'll just snap that word into a glyph of a home icon. And that's basically where you can set your font files up, you can set your fonts up so that certain characters which are next to each other will then actually combine and create a character of its own. So these font files are set up specifically so that you type the word home, and that will then display a home icon. It's really a beautiful technique because it's also readable by search engines then, obviously. So you could create your whole menu and have icons specifically for that. And then as you go down to a smaller device size, you could just change it so that it uses those special glyphs in that font file, or on your larger desktops, you don't use them and you just display the text instead. Does anyone know what that's called? No, I'll include that as well when I send out the actions for Photoshop. All right. Thanks very much, everyone.